I'm Molly Kimball. Welcome to Fueled, a wellness and nutrition podcast. I'm a registered dietitian and nutrition journalist with a passion to help people live their strongest, healthiest life possible. In my weekly TV segments and columns, there's a limited amount of time and space to cover everything, but there's so much more to share. This podcast is my opportunity to dive deeper into the topics you want to know about. Today's episode is all about adrenal fatigue, and it may or may not be something you've heard of. It may be something that you think you have. If you haven't heard of it, the symptoms are going to sound familiar to a lot of us. And so if you're reading up on it, you'll see, that you're feeling fatigued. There's digestive issues. It's hard to concentrate, tendency to gain weight. You're needing to rely on caffeine throughout the day. So a lot of people say, and there's more and more, we'll talk about more of these things that are associated with it. But a lot of the things that are descriptors or symptoms that align with what's referred to as adrenal fatigue really resonate with a lot of people and a lot of us. And it's easy to want to think that we have it. And so what we're covering today is what adrenal fatigue is, what it isn't. Is it really a thing? But whether or not it's really a thing, the symptoms and how we feel is very, very real. So we are joined today by an expert in the subject, Dr. Lynnette Nieman. She is head of the Endocrine Consult Services at the National Institute of Health, and she is also past president of the Endocrine Society. So welcome, Dr. Nieman. I am honored to have you join us today.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here.
So tell us what your role is with National Institute of Health and overseeing the endocrine side of this.
Yeah, so we have at the National Institutes of Health a hospital. It's the largest clinical research center in the world, and it's also a very large brick building, the second largest brick building in the world. And in this hospital, we see patients with a variety of disorders, and we perform research and care to try to get to the bottom of what their problems are. Some of the things we study are very well-known diseases, and some of the patients we see don't really even have a diagnosis. So we're very comfortable with the idea of a patient coming in and not being able to quite put our fingers on what's wrong with them. And in a number of instances, we've been able to discover new diseases and new disorders and then find ways of helping those patients. So this concept of adrenal fatigue and tiredness and stress-related physical and psychological symptoms is something that we see in a number of different kinds of situations.
How long have you been in the role? Because it's fascinating, what you just described. How long have you been in this position?
So I have been a tenured investigator here at the NIH since 1991, and I've been head of the consult service, I think, for about 20 years now.
So you've also seen in so many different trends come and go, things that didn't exist before. As you said, new diseases are discovered, but also things that, like the term adrenal fatigue, wasn't even used until the late 90s. So you've seen these things kind of come in, and people, their descriptions or their ideas of what might be wrong with them has probably evolved over these years as well.
Yes, that's absolutely true. And the concept of adrenal fatigue is that term really was coined, as you say, in the last 20 or 25 years. But the concept of having low functioning of your adrenal glands really dates back to the 1800s. At that point, a very distinguished physician in England, Sir Thomas Addison, described patients who were extremely fatigued. He used the term asthenia, and they had GI disturbances. They were hyperpigmented, and meaning their skin was very dark, and they tended to die. And he coined the term Addison's disease, or what he described was termed Addison's disease. And we know that now to be a disease of the adrenal glands in which they are destroyed or can't function properly. And so we call that primary adrenal insufficiency, meaning that the adrenal glands themselves are dysfunctional and really cannot be rescued. And so patients who have true adrenal insufficiency require replacement hormones for the hormones that they can't produce. And in the primary form of adrenal insufficiency, it's the entire outside layers of the adrenal gland that are destroyed. So you have to take cortisol, the stress hormone, as well as another hormone which replaces the hormone called aldosterone we normally make, which governs salt and water metabolism.
So
that's
tell us
adrenal insufficiency.
For someone who's not familiar with adrenal function, period, can you kind of give us a little 101 on what the adrenal glands are, where they are in our bodies, what they do, and what's the benefit of some of these stress hormones like cortisol? Because we always hear cortisol in a negative light, but if you're not producing it, you need to take it supplementally. So what's kind of how are our adrenal glands supposed to function normally, and what benefit do they give us?
That's a great question. Normally, the adrenal glands are very small structures. They sit on the top of the kidneys, so we have two of them, and they have two major layers. One is called the cortex, meaning the outside, and that one is the medulla, that's the inside part. The outer part makes steroid hormones like cortisol, aldosterone, and dehydroepiandrosterone. So those three hormones, the cortisol governs our fuel intake. It governs how we use sugars and to some extent fat. It also is important in stress, and I'll come back to that. The aldosterone hormone governs salt and water metabolism, so it allows us to absorb sodium so that we maintain enough water in our blood vessels to maintain our blood pressure. And the DHEA, or dihydroepiandrosterone, is a hormone that is slightly related to the male sex hormone testosterone. And its true function is not completely understood. The inside part of the adrenal gland makes epinephrine, and it is also involved with stress regulation and with blood pressure regulation. So the adrenal glands themselves are relatively complicated from what I've just said, but they are governed in a large measure, at least the cortisol production is governed by a hormone made by the pituitary gland called ACTH, and that in turn is governed by a hormone made by the hypothalamus called CRH. So there is this feed-forward stimulation of the adrenal glands by the ACTH, and then the cortisol feeds back upwards through the bloodstream to the brain, where the pituitary gland and the hypothalamus reside, and tells the brain that there's plenty of cortisol around and shuts it off. So that in our daily lives, our cortisol levels are lowest when we first go to sleep, and they begin to rise in the early hours of the night if we sleep at night, and then in the morning they're highest, and then they start to decline for the rest of the day. So that variation in cortisol is used by physicians to help diagnose a number of cortisol excess or cortisol deficiency states. And we use that complicated physiology to try to understand whether people have true adrenal insufficiency because we can give them the hormone ACTH and see if the adrenal glands can respond. And basically that's the test that we use to determine if someone has the capability to make sufficient amounts of cortisol.
And the theory of adrenal fatigue, what a lot of if you're looking online, for example, the theory behind this will be that with recurring stress, chronic stress, that our adrenal glands burn out and either stop or reduce the production of these necessary stress hormones. And then can you explain kind of, I guess, what the theory is of adrenal fatigue, and then also what the reality is as far as what the research shows?
Right. So interestingly, in terms of research, there's been almost no research on people who believe they may have adrenal fatigue. And so that is really one of the deficits we have in the medical community, because the patients with possible adrenal fatigue are not seen generally by typical Western trained physicians. They're oftentimes cared for by the naturopaths or other professionals who are providing this diagnosis and then providing advice for how to fix it. But the theory of adrenal fatigue is that, as you mentioned, people are under a lot of stress these days, and that this stress really allows the adrenal glands to get very revved up, but then after a while they can get revved up no more, and they, as you say, burn out. I must say that I see a number of people who think they have adrenal fatigue, and we test them as we would test for adrenal insufficiency, and I have not yet found someone who does not have a normal response to ACTH. But that doesn't mean that the patient doesn't truly have symptoms. And the symptoms of adrenal fatigue are incredibly nonspecific and extremely common. So the kinds of things that people come with as their main complaint is that they have aches in their body. They're fatigued, they're exhausted, they're nervous, they don't sleep well, they have various digestive problems, which can be loose stools to constipation to nausea. And they feel that they are just unable to get enough rest and to feel rested. And they have trouble getting up in the morning, and they feel overwhelmed, they feel run down. They feel that they have trouble bouncing back from illness or from stress. And they feel sometimes that they're eating bad food. They really want to have salty things and sweet things. And so you can see that if you put all of that together, probably all of us in the world have one or two of those symptoms on any particular day.
Right. It's really easy to self-diagnose with adrenal fatigue. So this is something that the term was coined a little over 20 years ago. And I heard a lot about it in the late 90s, early 2000s. And then it kind of died down a bit. But I feel like recently, every page I turn, I'm seeing something else about adrenal fatigue. Is there a reason that, well, first of all, do you see that it's more prevalent? Does it seem to be? And if so, why?
Well, yes, I do think that there's more interest in the lay press about this supposed disorder. And I think it is partly because it's an easy explanation for people's symptoms, and the press has become and social media have become so compressed so that it's sound bites are what people are interested in. It's a very short answer and a short reason for why you're feeling bad is what I think a lot of people are craving. And so it sort of fuels itself in a way. The other thing is that I think that there's much more ability of people to exchange information with the internet, with social media and things of that sort. So I think this spreads from person to person more quickly than it used to. And finally, I do think that we live in fraught times that are very stressful for many different reasons. For example, I work in a hospital, and people here are extremely concerned about the coronavirus, even though we have only about 25 cases in the United States. And so people are anxious and stressed about all sorts of things. And I think the stress levels have tended to go up in the last, say, 5 to 10 years. And I think that's why we're seeing much more of it. I must say it's not just folks here when I talk to my colleagues here, but when I speak at other institutions. If I'm speaking on this, I ask people to raise their hand if they've are seeing patients coming in who've made this diagnosis for themselves. And I would say that many more physicians are raising their hands that, yes, patients are coming in with this. So I think your sense of that as being more prevalent, more common right now is quite on the mark. And the difficult thing about making that diagnosis is that then you have an apparent answer to the problems that you're suffering from. And then if you believe in adrenal fatigue, there is a large litany of things you can do to make it better. And those things are very much, I think most of them are extremely commonsensical kinds of things that your mother would tell you to do or your doctor would tell you to do. So, for example, eat a good diet, have regular meals, chew your food well, make sure you get a variety of healthy foods, avoid bad foods. Then there's things like make sure you go to sleep early and sleep as much as you can. Don't set the alarm if you don't have to. Make sure you exercise. Try to minimize stress in your life. Try to have fun. Try to think about whether you need vitamins of one sort or another because you're not taking in a very healthy diet. So these kinds of things are, I think, very good advice for almost all people to really to have a healthy lifestyle and to think about wellness. And so it's hard to say the treatments that are offered are inappropriate. I think they're quite wonderful. The difficulty that I personally have with some of the recommendations are that they involve taking adrenal extracts. So this is when animals' adrenal glands are prepared in such a way that you can get the products of the adrenal gland into a pill form or into a liquid form and take them as a medicine. Obviously, if you don't need those hormones, you're potentially having risk of having too many hormones. And you also don't know what's in these preparations because they're not regulated by the FDA. And then there are a variety of other things that are promoted to be helpful to, quote unquote, support the adrenal glands, which contain usually a variety of herbs of one sort or another. Now, all of that, if those products were very benign without side effects, would be fine. But not only do I have a concern about medical side effects, but I have a concern about the side effects for your wallet, because these are extremely expensive supplements, and patients can spend quite a bit of money, $500 a month or sometimes more, to buy these supplements. So I think the real important thing is to get to the root of the problems that the patient is having. What are their symptoms? What might be other causes for those symptoms? And then try to deal with those, all the while having a good diet and exercising and trying to minimize stress.
It's also really easy for someone to say, well, if we see supplements, and I'm a believer in when it's something that's an appropriate supplement for that need, I'm a big believer in that. But when it's really easy to say, okay, I feel like I have these symptoms, I feel like it's adrenal fatigue, I'm going to take these supplements, but then not also very proactively make these lifestyle changes. And I think that just taking the supplements and, can make it easier for us to think, well, I'm taking care of that issue. I'm taking those supplements.
Right.
Without really being mindful about these other changes.
Yes, we live in a society where we always like to have a magic bullet, something easy to do that doesn't involve a lot of personal effort that will make everything get better. And I think we all know down deep that it's oftentimes not possible to achieve that. You have to put effort into these kinds of things. So I think the other problem with just stopping with the supplements is that these symptoms that people have can represent other very dangerous diseases, so that need to be treated in a different fashion. So, for example, these symptoms can be seen in patients with heart failure, in people with severe anemia, in people with sleep apnea, which is one of the major ways to most common thing that I see when someone comes in and says they're fatigued is that they have sleep apnea, or they have depression, or something going on in their lives at home and they're very stressed. So, I think it's really important not to ignore those symptoms, because those things deserve to be honored and to be investigated, and the patient deserves to have solutions to those symptoms that probably represent some other underlying disease. There's something that I learned from another physician once, which is the 5% solution. And I say, I just want you to think about something that can help your pain by 5%. And they'll get really annoyed at me and they'll say, 5%, that's nothing, doesn't make a difference. I said, yeah, but think about another 19 things besides that. and you won't have any pain. And that's sort of the approach I take. I mean, I think there's so many different ways of approaching these kinds of things that if you can chip at it little by little and do multiple things that help, you're going to get to where you want to go. And it's all about the patients is suffering. So, it doesn't do any good to say to somebody there is no such thing as adrenal fatigue and then not do anything else. I mean, I say to them, we don't recognize this as an entity, but I recognize that you're suffering. Let's talk about that.
And I think encouraging people to, if you do feel these symptoms, and again, these are things that almost all of us on any given day could say, yeah, we feel this a little bit. But I think one big thing is if something has changed recently, if it's more significant or more pronounced than usual, I think that's a big one too. That's a red flag, to start investigating why. But then realizing, just like Dr. Nieman said, there's so many things that can influence it. And some of them are things that are what we choose to put in our body. If our diet is centered on, poor quality foods and a lot of white refined carbohydrates and sugary drinks and alcohol and fast foods and things, we're on this roller coaster of energy, blood sugar. We're crashing. We have these highs and lows. And so it's no surprise that we feel so bottomed out. And so I think really taking a look, if you're feeling these things and you are tempted to think, okay, it's adrenal fatigue. If you want to think it's adrenal fatigue, that's okay, but don't excuse these others. And so someone can go to their physician and have their adrenal function tested. So what does that look like for someone? If you do suspect it, what would that look like to ask your physician about?
Yeah, so what you'll see on the internet for diagnosing adrenal fatigue would be a questionnaire asking about those symptoms we talked about. And then a number of providers will ask for salivary cortisol to be measured. So cortisol is excreted into our saliva, and we can be measured in the saliva. It's a very small amount of the total amount of cortisol that's in our blood is in our saliva. And so, but that can be measured. And many times patients will come in and they'll have a chart that has their time of day and that curve that I was talking about where the cortisol is very low at night and high in the morning. And they will be at the lower end of that supposedly normal range. And they'll conclude from that they have adrenal insufficiency or adrenal fatigue rather. The problem with that is that cortisol is secreted in the blood and into the saliva in pulses, meaning that it's like a little burst of it goes into the blood, and so the levels go up, but then they come down and until the next pulse comes and the burst goes up again. So those normal ranges are sort of averages of the upper and lower parts of the normal range. And people commonly can be at the lower part of the normal range and be quite normal. So if we see something like that, what I usually do, and if the patient has symptoms of adrenal insufficiency, I will do that ACTH stimulation test. And I will not do salivary cortisol tests because people actually don't go from fully normal adrenal function to about to die because of adrenal insufficiency. It's not an immediate kind of thing. It's usually a gradual decline. And this ACTH stimulation test is much more sensitive at identifying failure of the adrenal gland that's a real failure than is the salivary cortisol measurement.
And what does that test look like?
Yeah, that test is a pretty simple test. We put an IV in the arm, and we measure a cortisol level and sometimes an ACTH level at the baseline before we do anything. Then we give a synthetic form, a manufactured form of ACTH, and that is a very high dose for the adrenal gland, so it stimulates them to make cortisol. And then we measure cortisol at 30 and 60 minutes later. And then that's the end of it. We just send the bloods off for measurement of cortisol, and we have cutoff points. And doctors who are endocrinologists will argue a little bit about what is the correct cutoff point and how much ACTH you should give, but there are published norms about that. And clearly, if someone has adrenal insufficiency, the number that's very severe, the number is quite low. You do not get a high number. And when we can argue a little bit over what is the lowest or the highest number that we would see a normal person achieve, that doesn't really make much difference when you're thinking about adrenal insufficiency, where you're really looking at how low the final number actually is. So we do that. Patients with adrenal insufficiency also, I should mention, have a slightly different constellation of symptoms than what people with adrenal fatigue have, and that is that they typically have weight loss. And people with adrenal fatigue typically have had weight gain or are weight neutral. And in addition to the weight loss of adrenal insufficiency, we see the same kind of asthenia, the exhaustion and fatigue, needing to have naps, a foggy brain, and joint aches and pains, which is not, the joint aches and pains is not a major component of the adrenal fatigue constellation, but the joint aches and pains of adrenal insufficiency are similar to how you feel when you have a viral infection or the flu. And so oftentimes just by taking a history on patients who think they might have an adrenal problem, we can get a sense of whether this is true adrenal insufficiency or adrenal failure versus the possible components that would represent an adrenal fatigue kind
What is
of
the prevalence of adrenal insufficiency? What percent of the population is estimated to have it, and also adrenal failure?
So adrenal insufficiency would lead to adrenal failure, and the two of them together are very uncommon. I would say probably, I haven't looked these numbers up recently, but it's probably something on the order of 10 per million or something of that on that. So it's a rare
Really
disorder.
low, right? And so better for most of us, if you're convinced, if you're like, okay, this is something I'm pretty sure I have this, having these tests done, rule it out, but then really starting to look at, okay, what are my symptoms and how can I treat these? And sometimes it might mean meeting with a registered dietitian. It might mean meeting with a someone to do behavioral coaching and modification, working with a therapist of some sort, a social worker. There's a lot of things, and it might be simply that there's a lot of stressors happening acutely in your life right then, whether it's things with family or work or finances. And so kind of really getting to the root of if it's increased lately and these symptoms feel even stronger than usual, has something in our lifestyle changed that we can attribute it to? And either way, what in our lifestyle is changeable? And because a lot of things we're doing, we just keep doing them because it's the same thing we've always done, but we create that same cycle.
That's absolutely correct. And this is one of the areas of medicine where it isn't just about doctors. It is really about working together as a team to address all of these different issues, just as you mentioned, a registered dietitian to make sure that the food that's being consumed and what's being the beverages being consumed are healthy and well balanced. Trying to reach out to psychological support systems, whether that's a coach or a social worker or a psychiatrist, depending on what the problems are. For finances, we have financial advisors. I mean, it's one of the kinds of things where when I have someone come in, I encourage them to sit and write down all of their symptoms or the things that are bothering them, and then think about what's out there in the community that could help. And then to bring it back to the patient, to own their symptoms and own to empower them to find ways to feel better. So, for example, for some people, that means scheduling just a small part of their day for something that is really fun for them. For some people, they benefit tremendously from meditation, from mindfulness approaches to their living. For some people, it's to just sort of step back a little bit and say no more often. That's usually the women who need to say no to something, or to people who are asking them to do things. But, I think it's an opportunity to gain self-awareness and have some insight as to what things drive us to act in one way or the other, and what things are sort of keeping us down. And I think if people can see it in that way, that it's an opportunity for growth and for rejuvenation, to look really squarely at all of these things and figure out what's really getting to us. I think this experience can become a very positive one, and transformational even, depending on how far people want to take that. But if all you do is say, I have this thing and I'm going to spend my money on supplements, it's not necessarily going to get to the root of the matter.
I think some of the things that people rely on a lot, I hear and see caffeine as one. And when you look at something like caffeine, I guess, can you tell us about the effect of caffeine on our cortisol levels and our stress hormones? How does that, and how does it affect?
Yeah, it's a mixed literature. Some people feel that it has an effect. Some people feel it doesn't have an effect. It's very difficult to tease out caffeine per se versus the experimental environment or what's going on with someone. So it's a little bit tricky to say caffeine is really bad. Probably in large quantities, it's bad. It does cause your heart to race. It does make some people very jittery. In small moderation, it probably has some protective effects, and so it is probably not a bad thing to have, but probably is something that people should think about in terms of whether they're having any of the bad effects of it. For example, as people get older, and even some young people, drinking things with a lot of caffeine after a certain hour in the day, in the afternoon or in the evening, can really keep them up at night. And so the caffeine, which people will then use the next day to sort of wake up, is actually part of the problem with sleep. So caffeine is a great example of something that's, like so many things, it has some good aspects. It has some things that are not so good, and people have to look at how much of it they're using.
Controllable. We can easily monitor that. So if someone is having, and this is something I'm not familiar with, I'm curious about, if someone has, they're drinking an energy drink or they're drinking, a soup, I have a client who does a 4-shot espresso. Right. And does that, in theory, I guess I would think that it would stimulate our bodies to produce more stress hormones like cortisol. Is that not related? Would one?
No, it hasn't been clearly shown to be the case. The other thing to remember is that if you habitually drink a lot of caffeine-containing substances, and I'm glad you brought up the idea of the sports drinks or the energy drinks, because a lot of them do have caffeine in them, and quite a bit more than a cup of coffee might be. So things like green tea are going to have the least amount, and very strong espressos or some of the energy drinks are going to have the most amount of caffeine. But when your body is really an amazing thing, and when there's so much caffeine coming in, it actually downregulates its ability to respond to the caffeine, so it becomes less sensitive. And so people who habitually are drinking a lot of coffee, they need to drink more and more and more to get the effect. If you like coffee as a stimulant, and it is a drug, and we don't think of it that way, but it is, then the best thing probably is not to drink too much of it. So have that 1 cup in the morning and a cup in the afternoon, or having it in intervals, but sort of using it in moderation, and again, in a mindful way. If you like those effects of that particular drug, then use it when you need it, but you don't need to have that to drink all the time. Water is a very good hydrating beverage. So.
Picturing our listeners are now, as you're making your morning cup of coffee, you're going to be like, this is my drug of choice. Listening to Dr. Nieman.
I think for many of us it is.
It is
the drug of choice.
It certainly is for me. And so I think when to our listeners as well, so if you find yourself reaching for caffeine, either more than usual, or you just drink a lot of caffeinated beverages. If you're having a cup, 2, or even what would be considered 3 normal cups of coffee a day, that's all within moderation. And but a lot of times, what we consider a cup of coffee is about 6-ounce cup. So what people maybe are doing in the mornings might be 2.5 cups of coffee, and these big Go cups are from coffee shops. So that one giant coffee might actually be your 3 cups almost for the day. If you find that you're reaching for more and more, and throughout the day, you're constantly looking for that source of caffeine, that's another cue to start looking at why. Why do we feel like we need so much caffeine? Is it that we're not getting enough sleep? Another thing, what Dr. Nieman mentioned was kind of stepping away from a few things. If you feel that through the day, you feel that you have to be so revved up and go, and you have to be on, and have that flash response reaction time every time. Carve out 10 minutes a day, in the afternoon or whenever that time is, to just kind of take a walk, rejuvenate with something else completely different than caffeine. And so, because then the cycle happens that it's likely interfering with your sleep. And then when it interferes with our sleep, the next day we're craving more caffeine, and we've set ourselves up on this cycle. So really looking at certain things that I love your suggestion of keeping a log, logging what your symptoms are, and then not just being passive about it, but then, okay, what resources are in the community, like Dr. Nieman mentioned, that I could reach out to for help on this, a behavioral therapist or a dietitian? Do I need to meet with a physician about this? Have blood work done? What are my symptoms and what's out there externally? But what are my symptoms and which of these do I have some control over that probably some behaviors I'm doing are causing this circular spiral effect?
And sometimes, life conspires against us, and sometimes you just sort of have to wait things out. I mean, for example, people who've just had a child, they're not going to get a lot of sleep.
Right.
And,
Right.
you just have to face it. Life will go on and you will feel better at some point, but, probably you haven't switched into an adrenal fatigue mode just because you had a child. But that's a time, a great example of a time where many of the symptoms of this so-called disorder would occur. You're tired, you are having mood swings, you're feeling anxious about becoming a new parent and taking care of this child that you love, and it's you can see how you could take a situation like that and call it adrenal fatigue. But for anyone who's had a child, this is just what happens
Right.
when you have a child.
Right.
And so I think this is there's a certain amount of framing that goes on with anything in life. We all like to have we like to put a name on things. We like to understand, and we think that if we call it something, we have a better understanding of it. But sometimes it's better or a good idea to just sort of step back and take all of the symptoms as individual components and think about how you could try to help improve each of those separately. And then just realizing that if you've got a lot of things on your plate and a lot of things that are bothering you, you're not going to fix it all at once. It may take some time.
And I read something that you referred to as the couch potato syndrome.
Yes.
And
yes.
Tell me about that.
Well, so many of us are so busy, and then we come home at night and we just don't feel like doing anything. And we haven't exercised in the morning or during the day, but we're tired. So we sit down at night and we are on the couch and we're watching TV, or we're watching the internet, or we're maybe just reading a book. But we're not doing the healthy things that we know we probably should be doing, like getting some exercise. And I think the more you become what I call deconditioned or detuned, your body isn't exercising to its potential, or even 50% of its potential. When you don't exercise, your muscles get weaker and weaker and weaker, and then when you try to exercise, you feel worse and worse and worse. So it's another one of those vicious cycles that you were referring to that we get ourselves into when we stop trying to have a complete healthy approach to life. So, for the couch potato syndrome, I really encourage people to, get up, walk around during the day. Many of us work at desks with a computer. We're just here with our straining our body because we don't have good posture with our computers, and we don't get up and walk. And all of that sort of conspires to make us feel, less healthy, because we are actually weaker than what we should be for that particular stage of our life. So I think trying to build exercise into your daily life by walking a little bit farther from the parking lot to your workplace, taking a break at lunchtime, having walking meetings with your colleagues, those kinds of things I think are very important. And to realize that if you're having symptoms of the so-called adrenal fatigue syndrome, that you should probably think very seriously about three things. One is sleep, one is food, and one is exercise. And if you're doing a pretty good job of all of those and you still have symptoms, then I would be concerned about an underlying medical condition. If you're not doing such a good job of those, I would still check with a doctor if you feel really bad in a physical sense, but I think it's a wake-up call to try to improve those 3 really important components in your life.
And also the bottom line, if you're Googling adrenal fatigue and looking at the symptoms and poring over these and do I have these, that right there is a cue to us that something is going on and we need to take a closer look if we're even interested in it to see if we have it.
Yes.
Yes. Okay. Well, I really appreciate it. I appreciate your time, and I will link to some of the great journal articles and content that you've been quoted throughout. So I'll have links to that in these podcast episode notes. And then I can put a link also to the National Institutes of Health with the endocrine consult area where Dr. Nieman is as well. But I really appreciate your time. Thank you so much.
You're quite welcome. It's a very important word to get out, and I'm happy to help.
Thank you. We're so grateful to Dr. Nieman for joining us today. I learned a lot from her. I hope that you guys enjoyed it as much as I did. And as mentioned, you can find the links that she talked about in the show notes of this episode. I am registered dietitian Molly Kimball, and you've been listening to Fueled Wellness and Nutrition, the podcast. And if you would like more Fueled Wellness and Nutrition, please head over to mollykimball.com, and you can follow me, Molly Kimball RD, on Instagram, Facebook, and Twitter. If you haven't yet, please go to Apple Podcasts and subscribe, rate, and review this podcast. And join us next week for another dose of Fueled Wellness and Nutrition. Thanks for listening, and stay focused on living your strongest, healthiest life.